Mondays with Mike.
So, after vacillating on this issue, it was reported on Thursday that Trump said to an NBC reporter that he will send the weapons to NATO and that they will send them to Ukraine. He initially delayed the shipment of weapons around the same time as Russia launched its largest attack against Kyiv since the beginning of the war. But lately, Trump has been saying that although Putin talks nice, in quotes, that's just what it is. It's just talk, and it doesn't end up backed up by much. Is it possible that Trump has now just been in international affairs long enough that he gets the dealio, or alternatively, is that just wishful thinking?
No, I actually think that he's been there for a long time of thinking that Putin's not as trustworthy as he could be. It's just that he's being more public about it. A lot
Mm-hmm.
of the moves that were made earlier on in his administration were because they had those ongoing negotiations between Russia and Ukraine where Trump was trying to, I don't know, soften the language. He was trying to mitigate the worst possible harms that could happen from all the saber rattling and the fiery language that happens during war because they were trying to negotiate a kind of ceasefire, a kind of peace agreement, a kind of cessation of hostilities. That well seems to have finally run dry for Trump, that he's arrived at the conclusion that despite his best efforts, he maybe put a little too much faith in Putin's his genuine attempts at peace. But I think that he's been there for a while. When Putin broke the ceasefire that they made, I think it was a few months ago, where they attacked one of the cities like right after they hammered out a ceasefire between the president of Ukraine and Russia. You remember that meeting where he was like, "You don't have the cards. You don't have the cards."
Oh, yes,
Yes,
I
I
do
do
remember
remember.
that meeting.
And like right after that meeting, there were a whole series of events that occurred. They were hammering out some kind of agreement or deal. That deal fell through. Now we're finally at the point where he just the tides have turned a bit, and he's trying to get NATO more involved because they said they'd pony up more money for defense. In some respects, if I'm looking at this as a long game, what Trump was doing was actually trying to get NATO to become more involved in helping support Ukraine, but also in spending more money on security for NATO. And one way you do that is you make Europe and NATO think that the US is backing away from the conflict. And in some ways it was, right? There were a few days where like really bad things went down that seemed to appear, at least from an outside observer, like the US was backing away a little bit from helping Ukraine with intelligence assistance at least. But I do think the tide has shifted because time and again, right, Trump keeps like saying, "Oh, there's a ceasefire. Oh, there's a ceasefire," and then there isn't. Right. This actually accomplishes two different goals. So, goal one is to get NATO to buy more U.S. stuff. So, usually, U.S. military aid is in the form of the U.S. selling weapons and systems and stuff to a country and then reimbursing that country. Right. So, it accomplishes two goals. Right. It's like a back end welfare for the military industrial complex, the defense contractors, and it gets all these different groups more enmeshed with U.S. weapon systems that the U.S. has to then provide support for. So that's the big thing is that when the U.S. sells systems to other countries, like a missile system or some kind of proprietary system that it controls, usually, at least that's my understanding, is that the U.S. also provides support for if there's anything wrong with those systems, right? So fixing it, technicians, that kind of thing. That creates more jobs for U.S. workers. It's great for all the donors and supporters who are like, great, more money at the trough. And it also accomplishes the other goal, which is defense spending, an increase in security for Ukraine when they're asking for it. So, in that sense, I think that this is a win-win for Trump from that perspective, from like a economic domestic policy perspective, because more money equals more stuff for everyone. It's great. The risk that he's running, and it's the risk that's always been there the whole time, is that Russia keeps saying that they won't hesitate to use nukes at some point. The question just becomes at what point, and it's not so clear at what point, right?
Yeah. Have you ever heard, and this was a saying among, I don't remember if it was the U.S. State Department or who, it was a saying among certain officials regarding the Chinese Communist Party. Have you ever heard of the concept of the Chinese final warning? Apparently I don't remember if it was the 1950s or something like that.
Actually, do you mean in the Korean War when China massed just like a huge number of troops on the border between North and South Korea, which was what prompted MacArthur to be like, I have to nuke?
No, I'm not thinking of that because China was involved in the Korean War. It wasn't bluster. But like when we would fly over Taiwan or assist Taiwan in a certain way, China would be like, look, this is your final warning. Just Google Chinese final warning. So first of all, you have this phrase, which is earwormy, which is end the forever wars. And I'm thinking, we ended the Afghanistan war, and we're not in Iraq anymore. And I'm not saying U.S. troops are not engaged anywhere in the world, but in fact, like a lot of the places where we are engaged is kind of limited. But a lot of Trump voters, they want, I'm not going to put words in their mouth, but it's somewhere in between. They don't want to pay for helping foreigners at one end of the spectrum. They don't want to help. And on the other end of the spectrum, you might argue, they want a peaceful world. And so you might hear some of them say, end the forever wars. We're getting into, this is us being involved. Okay, to some degree it is. But this old game has been playing out our whole lives. When Bush said, I looked into Putin's eyes, and he's a good man. And who knows? So this game, whether Bush believed it at that point or not, is another thing. So Trump, he bombed Iran, and now they're supplying the weapons. And on the surface of it, this seems like a jingoistic, belligerent thing to do. And if we just teleported onto a game board and we didn't know any of the players and there were no pre-established norms, then maybe it would be. But alternatively, this is how superpowers fight in a safe, I put scare quotes around that, way, where it's like proxy wars. Same thing as in the Cold War. You don't want a direct conflict. Believe it or not, I think this steers us clearer. Trump understands, which appears that he does, knock on wood, because you never know, madman diplomacy. What would be worse is if you had a big country, Russia, gobbling up small countries. And Ukraine's not even that small of a country, so if they can gobble up Ukraine, they can gobble up Estonia, whatever it is.
Yeah, so Ukraine functions as a firewall for the EU and NATO. Ukraine's not part of NATO, but it is NATO leaning, meaning that we'd rather they work with NATO than against NATO, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I think you're right that at least for right now, the sort of standard operating procedure for superpowers is these proxy wars. Is you have these there's sandboxes that you've got a periphery, right? So you've got, if you look at a map, you've got all these huge countries are contained, they're hemmed in at their borders by NATO, and then you've got China that's contained a little bit by Japan, and then the DMZ in South Korea. And if you look at a map, there's a big old circle, right, around all these huge countries that have nukes and that have large standing armies, and they never really go outside of that circle, right? Is that in terms of how they operate, if you look at the world and where the military operations are, every time they move even a little bit outside of those circles in airspace, in the ocean, on ground, they get rebuffed, right? They get surrounded and they get yelled at a little bit. And they're like, stop doing that. So when China goes into the Sengoku Islands or throws a hissy fit against Japan and they have a bit of an argument over who owns what, then the US shows up with a whole bunch of ships and says, no, you're not doing it. It's not happening. Or with Taiwan, right? They signal the defense systems and the defense agreement. And China's, oh, Taiwan's part of China, we're going to fight, blah, blah, blah. And the US, as it goes, nope, not happening. And the same deal with South Korea. That's an ongoing war that, sure, we've never actually declared a peace agreement, so there's an armistice of sorts. But initially, that was a United Nations mission, and the U.S. just took up the mantle, right? At the end of it, when the UN backed out of it, the U.S. was like, okay, we'll just do it. And we have for many decades now. And the whole point of it is that uh, we're not going to have, I think, a direct confrontation. We might in our lifetimes if someone's crazy enough, but we're probably not going to have a direct confrontation.
Wouldn't help us, wouldn't help them.
Yeah, no one wins, right? Because the nature of the weaponry right now is so ridiculous that even to use it, even to consider using it, it would be so egregious. Because remember, these weapons aren't what hit Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those were bad. If you read the descriptions of what those were, they're bad. If you look at the tests that they've done, 100 times stronger, 500 times, 1,000 times. Like the numbers get really bad if you consider the ramifications of ever actually using them. And so that's why we get to this point where there's like a limit to the kinds of warfare that occur, to conventional warfare, cyber warfare, the kinds of weapons that are being used, is that they're always trying to limit the sort of theater of conflict, the arena of combat. Because if you let it spiral out of control, these countries know, and the US, I'm sure, knows, that it can get bad fast. And the bad fast part is really bad. And yeah, I think right now, at least, we're not even escalating to a big war. All the support still is just the same kind of thing that we were doing earlier for Ukraine during the Biden administration, during even the first Trump administration. We were giving support to Ukraine because Congress approved it. It's just the same thing. It's just the same stuff, the weapons, ammunition, various systems. And the whole point is that they continue to serve as a bulwark, as a sort of shield against further escalation or further spread throughout Europe. And you're right. I don't think the U.S. wants Russia gobbling up any other little country and trying to become bigger and expand its territory even more, because that sends us backwards into a time of naked aggression, of World War II and World War One. Hitler stomping into the Sudetenland and saying, mine, and just snatching up stuff and then daring everyone to take it back from him. We don't want that. We don't want a fortress Europe again. We don't want giant guns positioned every few miles and huge amounts of troops covering all airspace such that it becomes very difficult. Europe becomes like a porcupine. You try to reach in and a spine in the hand, right? Yeah. That's what we don't want. Right now, it's not perfect. The system that we have right now isn't perfect, but the containment is still working, where there is no major war. There's little wars. There's Israel versus a lot of countries. There's the U.S. stopping the Houthi, trying to stop the Houthis in the Red Sea.
That flared up again. I forgot to put that on the show notes. Of course, it just was a recent flare up. But no, that Trump. I guess Trump shouldn't have taken their word for it.
No,
in terms of when they're not going to attack. Yeah.
Don't take the word of people who are engaged in active, open rebellion against their own country.
Captain Hook told me he wasn't going to terrorize Netherland anymore, and let's take his word for it briefly.
Yeah, no, because in some ways, what they're doing amounts more to like piracy or terrorism than it does to like fighting in a war. Because the problem that they're doing is they're not attacking military targets necessarily; they're attacking shipping lanes and commercial ships, right? Ships carrying non-military things like furniture and oil.
If I'm thinking about this, like from a Russian strategist perspective, I don't know how you would measure a preeminent nation, but there's us and there's China, and those are like the top two. And like third might be Russia, might be India. I don't know. Might be some other country. But the point is, Russia, because it went toe-to-toe with us during the Cold War, when they were the Soviet Union and when they were bigger. They got the space program, they got the nukes, and they've got the land area, they do have oil, they got rare earths, probably. Because in a world in which Saddam Hussein can't occupy Kuwait without huge brouhaha and he gets repulsed, and then they go back for revenge 12 years later, In such a world, just as a disclaimer, I guess this is for now, who's gonna impede the territorial sovereignty of Russia? Now, if they believe the territorial sovereignty of Russia is that of the Soviet Union, there were a lot of ethnicities there. But in the 21st century, I think the Chinese have a better strategy, or have had a better strategy. And what do I know? I don't have a degree in this stuff, but they got ports around the world. And, like, the Russians are smart. They got scientists. They're very smart. They could do very well. Somebody from Russia wrote in an editorial that they thought they were going to storm into Kyiv and it was going to be over. The Western world order is over. But they might be right in a certain way. Like the post-war moment, like the end of history moment, is over. So I just hope that they have an expansive hope for their own future, and that it'll come through preeminence, and that they don't have to worry for their own territorial sovereignty. But there is probably very much that I'm missing. So I just hope we can coexist with Russia at some point in the not too far distant future, but I guess this thing's got to grind on, which is a shame.
Any country that has nukes is effectively a cut above the rest in terms of their power. And the lesson, if there's any lesson I've seen from the last 20, 30 years, is that when a country gives up its nukes, it becomes vulnerable. So what's happening in Ukraine is almost definitely a direct result of it giving up its nuclear weapons and handing them back over to, I think they gave them back to Russia because they're never Russia's nukes. Ukraine just happened to have them. But the point here is that when they handed over all those nukes, there was a pretty serious agreement that was hammered out that said, we will protect your sovereignty, we'll protect your territorial sovereignty, we won't invade you, blah, 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 all the things. We won't do the things that you don't want us to do if you denuclearize, if you don't continue to hold these weapons. Ukraine took them at their word, and now we see what's going on, which is that some of the parties to that agreement were not acting apparently in good faith, because one of the parties to that agreement was Russia. Russia said, we won't invade you. Oops, they invaded. So the lesson here seems to be words are great, but the words are cheap. The thing that countries seem to respect more than anything is that they're like a honey badger. Again, I love the analogy of a honey badger.
Yes,
that even if
the honey badger.
Even if it's a much smaller animal, it's immune to venom and toxins, so it'll take on opponents way larger than it is and chase them away and win, because it makes itself really scary and annoying. Same deal with nukes right now in the modern age. There's a reason that some countries are making a very serious effort to acquire nuclear weapons, is because it creates a certain level of security.
Yeah.
A baseline level of security that at an absolute minimum, they know, and the countries attacking them know, that whoever uses the nukes is opening Pandora's box, and it's going to be terrible, because it's a Pyrrhic victory. There is no winning with a weapon that expands beyond the borders of wherever it's deployed. The damage of the weapon, the radioactive, whatever, the cloud, and the toxic nature of how it affects the land, the sea, the air. And so it's one of those things where I'm actually trying to think of circumstances where a nuclear weapon would be used in our lifetime, and there's a handful of circumstances. If a giant rock was hurtling towards Earth and we needed to just move it, just nudge it,
Armageddon,
just a tiny little bit, just blow a bunch of nukes in space and just move it. Just a tiny little nudge. Just
all it takes.
Push it a little bit away, just a little teeny tiny bit away, so it gets out of our gravitational, or whatever you call it, so it doesn't hit us.
Maybe we should do that with a 2032 object, just to see if we can do it.
Yeah, but the point is, that's one circumstance where I 100% see nukes might be deployed, because the science is pretty straightforward, right? You just make big boom in space moves the smaller thing just slightly, just a little teeny tiny bit away. That I can see. Another circumstance would be if those UAE people, all the hearings and stuff, if they're actually right that there's some kind of, I don't know, intelligence or power that's capable of technology we don't have. If they were to show up in force, some extraterrestrial group, nukes may be our only option to respond to them. And even then, who knows, right? They may not be enough if they have technology that's better than ours. But that's one circumstance I see if there's some kind of like unifying threat, so Independence Day kind of thing, like giant ships show up over cities and start just like
Sure.
slurping people up out of off the ground. And be like, we need some way to fight them. So I could see that. Right? Is it going to happen? Probably not. Could it happen?
But who knows?
Who knows? We don't know. That's the whole problem. Is we don't know. And if we don't know what we don't know. And it's a great big universe, and there's a lot of stuff out there, and we don't know about most of it. And frankly,
Yeah.
what we do know is like the distant past, like the very distant past. Whatever we're seeing is like a projection of something that happened a long time ago, and we're just seeing the after effects. So it's not
Right.
like we know what's going on in the local neighborhood all that much because it's so far
No.
away. We just don't. The other scenario is, yeah, if there is some kind of massive worldwide conflict on the scale of World War I or II, where you have a large number of countries that have these kinds of weapons that are fighting against each other. There are like a handful of scenarios I envision where this happens. The one that's most likely right now is if Russia does gobble up like bits and pieces of Ukraine, like a third or something, and then turns its eye towards other countries, a la Hitler. It's like, why stop at Ukraine? Let's go to Poland and Lithuania and Estonia and Latvia and all the other countries. And at that point, NATO gets tested in a real way. Is the Article 5 an actual?
Yeah, and you ask why stop at Ukraine. And the reason, just to interject, the reason why to stop at Ukraine is currently in the West, people are not psychologically prepared for war. But if we see countries getting gobbled up, then our governments, I would say our governments would know how to get us psychologically prepared for war. It's come on, I don't want to. I don't want to go to war. You want to go to Baskin Robbins or something? This is not an advertisement for Baskin Robbins, but so just like in order, why stop at Ukraine? In order to demonstrate, correctly or incorrectly, to the mind of the Westerners that war is avoidable. It would be my primary reason to say why stop at Ukraine. But I'm sorry to interrupt. That was just like an M dash.
No worries. So I would actually say that the U.S. has been prepared for war since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So if you look at war as a conversation between countries, where if sovereignty is like the ultimate embodiment of a monopoly of force over a certain area, right? That you're armed to the teeth, you're bristling with weapons, and you're saying, don't mess with us because we've got all these weapons, then the use of nukes and the existence of nukes, this shot across the bow, as it were, for the United States saying, we're the top dog, don't mess with us, to all the other countries of the world have been trying to figure out ways to manage that issue. There are these weapons that can cause so much devastation, and there's no effective way to stop something that you could evacuate everybody from a place if you've got enough warning. And so the only thing that's damaged is the land, the buildings, the air. But the after effects are still, in many senses, permanent. Not permanent, but they won't go away for thousands of years. The half life on some of the radiation. And so that's why Truman fired MacArthur, for example, is that MacArthur was looking like short term. I want to win this war. I want to win this war by causing huge devastation in a certain place. And Truman's like, if you do that, you're going to embroil us in essentially a war for the next 1,000. Like, we'll never leave. They will hate us forever. It will never go away. Whoever lives there or near it will hate us forever because you're poisoning the land, the rivers, the air. You're making it completely unlivable, and you would have had the largest refugee crisis in the history of humanity, no question. It was the densest populated part of the world. It was going to be bad.
It's coming from the guy who dropped the bomb, and even he knew.
Exactly. That's the point, right? Is that even he understood. You only ever use it one time. You send the message, don't mess with us, and then the threat alone should be enough, would be enough in a rational world to keep virtually any other country that's, we hope, rational and acting in a rational way from ever really messing with us. Yes, they'll nibble at the edges, they'll act in clandestine ways, they'll do spying and proxy wars. They'll send out guerrilla fighters fighting in asymmetric warfare. But there's never going to be, unless everybody just loses their collective minds, a giant nuclear Armageddon of the likes that we saw with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I don't see it unless the only real risk is if these countries, if Russia, China, India, Pakistan, any of the countries that have nukes, if they have an internal collapse. So I think part of the reason that the U.S. was providing so much defense aid during the war in Afghanistan to Pakistan, if you look at foreign aid that we're giving during the war in Afghanistan, a lot of it was going to Pakistan. I think part of that was to ensure stability on the ground in Pakistan. Quite seriously.
Yeah.
It was just to ensure that they had a stable, functioning government, a stable, functioning military apparatus, a stable function. Because it's not like Pakistan were really our friends during the.
No.
But they were so stable they could shelter bin Laden.
Yeah, but the point is that the risk of instability was so great, right?
Yeah.
That even with the terrible stuff going on within the borders of Pakistan, even the people hiding there and the problems that pose, wasn't enough to stop the U.S. from continuing to give just tremendous amounts of money in defense aid to ensure that Pakistan, that had nukes, was stable enough that it didn't break out into a huge civil war. Because the risk we run is something called rogue nukes, right? Rogue nations, where you have these like splinter groups breaking off that have control of these weapons that don't have any kind of rational basis for survival, that don't care, that will just use the weapons just to cause chaos. That's scary. And part of the reason I think that there's such an effort, it is scary. And part of the reason I think there's such an effort to stop nuclear proliferation is to stop that, right? Is that countries occasionally fail. They have civil wars, they break out in rebellion. And you look at history long enough, most countries have some kind of instability in their history. There's no perfect country, right? There's no country that's just lasted forever and been the very best, that's never had any kind of dissidence within the boundaries of the country. That's the constant, like, ever pressing risk that exists. The reason you want to have really good spy agencies and intelligence gathering is to stop something like that, to make sure that the inner systems, that the works of all these countries are still humming along. And if they're not, if there is a doomsday scenario on the horizon, that you use every tool in the toolkit to stop that from happening, right? And that's why you need really good intelligence.
Yeah. And you used the phrase, with a nuke, the message is don't mess with us. I think that initially, like when we were the only ones with nukes, that certainly was the message, and it is still to a degree. But I think it's more might be, if you mess with us, and if it goes on a while, if you mess with us, it will fall down a hill. A boulder will fall down a hill, and if it continues in a certain direction, there is a chance of Armageddon. And so, don't you push that boulder down that hill. Because countries have messed with us, and countries since 1945 have not been nuked.
Nothing near the scale of World War II. So what I mean by messing with us is completely cutting off our supply chains, blowing up our ships. So, for example, the Lusitania or the supply convoys or anything like that, like making it really annoying to operate in the world. We haven't had anything quite on that scale. So any conflict we've had has usually been contained. So the war in Iraq was pretty much contained to Iraq. War in Afghanistan was pretty much contained to Afghanistan. It didn't spill over.
Even during Vietnam, they went, and like, it was, for those who got drafted, it was hell, no doubt. But life in the U.S. was life in the U.S.
Yeah, it just kept going. That's the thing. Like, we haven't had, to the best of my knowledge, other than 9/11, the United States hasn't actually had any significant attack on U.S. soil proper, on like the homeland of the U.S., by any military power. Yes, there have been asymmetric warfare, right? Like little small groups of violent people that are unpredictable, those lone wolf people, but nothing big. The biggest attack would have been either the attack on the Cole or the blowing up of the barracks in Lebanon of the Marines, because that was a direct attack on U.S. military personnel. But in terms of an actual direct attack on the scale of Pearl Harbor, no, nothing anywhere close has happened since Pearl Harbor.
Except 9/11, yeah.
The way to think of 9/11, at least in my mind, isn't necessarily a military attack because it wasn't from a country. It's a giant single act of mass murder. It was a bunch of different acts of mass murder in different locations, but it wasn't an attack by a country in the sense that it was going to cause an ongoing war because the groups involved weren't actually, at least as far as I know, weren't part of any kind of country's military force. But that's a whole mess. That certainly showed a vulnerability in the system. So much of our focus was on stopping countries. The system we have in place, the military apparatus, the carriers, the full spectrum dominance, control of the space, air, land, ocean, ground, and then cyber, is pretty effective at keeping countries from attacking the United States. It's pretty effective at convincing rational actors that it's a bad idea to get into a mess with the United States, period. It's not as effective, unfortunately, as we've seen at deterring non-military actors that have ideological or dogmatic reasons for acting in the way that they do. It's not that great at stopping that because they're acting in what might be called irrational ways, in ways that we can't necessarily predict very well. And that's what the 9/11 Commission report arrived at. For one of their conclusions was that there was a failure of imagination, that so much of our focus was always put on sovereign countries acting in ways that we might consider conventional: planes, bombs, uniformed soldiers, troops on the ground, tanks, that kind of fighting. And there wasn't as much focus, unfortunately, for national defense put into the sort of non-military actors. Now there definitely is now for the resources that are invested in figuring out how to stop that kind of stuff. But yeah, that's the big fear, at least, of having a greater than zero probability of happening, is if any one of these countries that has nukes, for whatever reason, fails, and those nukes get in the hands of people who aren't sovereign countries, that don't act in rational sovereign country ways. That is the fear. That's the point I was trying to make.
Yeah, and if you look at the flexibility of international borders pre-1945 to post-1945, and I'm talking pre-1945, it goes back throughout history, like it's night and day. We're not just talking Hitler. Like, we're not just talking Napoleon. We're talking Africa, 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. We're talking Genghis Khan. We're talking many conquerors. We're talking Europe in the, throughout history, Europe with the Ottomans, and then Europe in the wars of religion, and then the wars of succession. And you would go to war a lot easier. But now, we might not like as Bush calls them, the mullahs. We might not like the government of Iran. But more than us not liking that, we don't want it becoming another Afghanistan. We don't want it becoming another Somalia. You cannot have, in this world, areas, you need to make as few places that individual nuts can go and just have their way with whatever, because what if they get a nuke? It's bad enough, and you said 9/11, and that happened when you went to Afghanistan, and the lawless place that it was. Not to say no laws, but what I'm saying is without one effective central government. And indeed, the problem came from such lawless areas. So we have not done, because we were also waging the Cold War, we haven't done a perfect job of this, of stabilizing international borders, and thus, hopefully, keeping the areas that are governed stable. We haven't done a perfect job of that since World War II. Morocco unto Western Sahara, Israel, various things. And I'm sure there are other examples. But by comparison, we've done a pretty good job. And what better, and I'm not saying, if it's a stable border, then the people in it are leading good lives. But if it is an unstable border, it's likely that they're not. So in that sense, I guess it's a good time to be alive. Funny way to think of it. We're not doing a perfect job. But is our Romania and Bulgaria gonna get into it as to where that border should be? No, they're not. There are a lot of places where the borders are frozen, and that to me is the story of the international order since World War II.
Yeah, so I agree, but this is going to sound a little strange. It's both the most dangerous time to be alive, but also one of the safest times to be alive, if that makes any sense. It's one of the most dangerous times to be alive because the possibility of complete annihilation exists. We know it
Yeah.
exists, but it's also one of the safest times to be alive because that possibility creates a sort of level playing field that limits how far war will ever escalate again. We know and we understand that if wars escalate too far, if people and countries really feel that their backs are against the wall and it's the end times, it's doomsday, they have nothing else, then they can just fire off all their weapons at once and then everything goes into complete and absolute chaos. It creates a sort of limiting factor on how bad war can get and will get between countries ever again. With one caveat, which is that if we manage to expand in any significant way out into space, then what you're going
Yeah.
to get is countries just snatching up planets and being like mine and then not sharing. That's going to get messy, but we're not there yet. But I could get there. If anyone figures out how to harvest resources from the asteroid belts, or if Musk succeeds in getting to Mars within our lifetimes, I don't see it getting messy until we find a planet or some celestial object or some area out in space that everybody wants. And then it gets messy. It gets really messy because Earth is a planet of finite resources. Those resources are, as we know, running out, right? So there's only so many wells you can dig, only so many mines you can build, only so much stuff you can get from the planet. You got to find a plan B, C, D, E, F, G, alternative options
Yeah.
once the well runs dry, as it were, for planet Earth, because there's a lot of people, and
Yeah.
those people want stuff.
I know. Much of my childhood, much of my actually elementary school childhood, was taken up with the belief of, okay, we got finite resources, and we got the resources now, but our descendants won't have the resources. So essentially, it was like an H.G. Wells kind of thing where, okay, eventually the planet will become bare and it'll just be worse and worse as time goes on, was the way that Child Bud thought of it. And I put that on myself. Nobody did that to me. Maybe literature didn't.
Our thinking is limited in some senses by the current
Yeah.
science that exists. So the ocean's really big. There's still stuff
Right.
there we haven't found. And then there's a lot beneath us down to the core that's just sitting there that we haven't really used because it's just really hard to get to due to pressure, right? The further down you go,
Right.
the easier it is to just get squished into a little ball. I guess the risk we run for going down too far or taking out stuff too far down in the core is we don't know what the effects would be on the Earth's magnetism. If you take up too much stuff from beneath us, it's not clear how much stuff is needed just to keep the Earth spinning as it is. And so you need a certain amount of mass and a certain amount of stuff. And it just needs to sit there and do that. And so our best bet is to just not mess around too much with what's beneath us
Yeah.
and to look out towards space, right? Towards stuff that's not being used. Rocks and planets and moons and all that stuff. Use that stuff or harvest gases. I don't know, the gases from the big gas giants. We can figure out a way to use those gases to do anything really that would be useful. But no, the whole point is like all that we have is only for now, right? All the tools that we have in the toolkit, all the weapons, all the countries, all the apparatus, it's just for now, right? Like human technology has been progressing so much and so fast in so many different ways that we don't know necessarily what the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years will look like. The future of warfare could be really quick, right? It could be cyber warfare of whoever figures out a way to shut down the systems fast enough wins. If you can't press the button and the button makes the thing go boom, you win. Whoever can do that wins. If they can shut it all off with an EMP or some kind of remote technology to stop the electrical circuitry or whatever, who knows? But whoever does that, they win, right? Because if you can't use the stuff you have, It's just a bunch of very expensive museum pieces and art decorations, right? If you can't use it, what's the point of having it other than having spent a lot of money on it and you can stare at it and go, this was a waste of money, right? Like, maybe we should have spent all our money in investing in that one thing that stops it all from working.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, that's the point I'm making. Did you want to talk about?
Yes, one more little soundbite first. Dr. Oppenheimer, what have we got? A peaceful world if you can keep it.
Mondays with Mike.